Across the vast expanse of the African continent, a striking paradox unfolds every single day. In gleaming urban centers, the wealthy dine on meals that cost thousands of dollars, residing in opulent homes that rival any luxury property worldwide. Yet just miles away, millions struggle to access even a single glass of clean drinking water. Malnutrition stalks entire communities. Families work exhausting hours under the scorching sun, their bodies weakened by hunger, their futures uncertain. The numbers tell a devastating story. Every year, millions of Africans die in silence, victims not of war or disease alone, but of poverty and the chronic lack of adequate nutrition. These are deaths that could be prevented, lives that could be saved, futures that could be rewritten. But something is changing on this ancient continent. China has launched an ambitious agricultural initiative that could reshape the food security landscape of Africa forever. The plan? Invest $250 million over the next 5 years to develop 100,000 hectares of productive farmland. If this project succeeds as planned, the harvests from these fields could feed approximately 3 million people annually, a lifeline for communities that have known hunger for generations. For impoverished families across Africa, this represents more than just an agricultural project. It represents hope, a chance at survival, a pathway out of the crushing cycle of starvation and desperation. Yet not everyone welcomes this development. Western agricultural corporations, companies that have dominated Africa's food systems for decades, are watching nervously. China's expansion into African agriculture threatens to disrupt long-established profit streams and challenge the status quo that has benefited foreign enterprises for generations. This raises critical questions that we'll explore today. Media, animated map showing China's agricultural investments in Africa, close-up of hands exchanging money over farmland contract, African farmers listening to Chinese agricultural training. What drives China's determination to cultivate such massive tracts of African land? Why does this agricultural initiative threaten the interests of Western corporations? And what does this mean for the future of food security, not just in Africa, but globally? If you find value in this kind of in-depth analysis, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss our latest investigations into the forces shaping our world. Now let's dive deep into this story. The hunger crisis. Africa's paradox of plenty. A United Nations assessment published in 2024 revealed a staggering reality. More than 500 million people worldwide experience hunger every single day. Africa bears nearly half of this global burden, a continent where empty stomachs have become tragically normalized. Here's what makes this crisis particularly heartbreaking. Africa possesses extraordinary natural wealth. The continent holds approximately 60% of the world's unused arable land, vast territories with the potential to become agricultural powerhouses. The soil is there, the space is there, the possibility is there. Yet incredibly, less than 30% of Africa's available farmland is actually being cultivated and used productively. Enormous stretches of potentially fertile land lie dormant while populations go hungry. What explains this tragic mismatch between potential and reality? The roots of the problem run deep. Decades of armed conflict and civil war have ravaged numerous African nations, destroying infrastructure and displacing farming communities. Political instability creates an environment where long-term agricultural investment becomes nearly impossible. Economic development has lagged far behind other regions, leaving farmers without access to the capital, technology, and resources they desperately need. Rural farmers, the backbone of any agricultural system, find themselves trapped in poverty. They cannot afford modern farming equipment that could multiply their yields. They lack access to improved seed varieties, fertilizers, and irrigation systems that have transformed agriculture in other parts of the world. Even something as basic as expanding their planting areas becomes an insurmountable challenge when you're living hand-to-mouth. Climate presents another formidable obstacle. Africa experiences some of the most unpredictable and extreme weather patterns on Earth. Devastating droughts can parch the land for months, turning once promising fields into cracked, lifeless dust. Then sudden floods can wash away entire seasons of work in a matter of hours. Farmers plant their crops with hope, only to watch natural disasters destroy their harvests before they can be reaped. This combination of factors, conflict, political fragility, economic weakness, technological gaps, and climate volatility, creates a perfect storm that keeps African agriculture locked in a cycle of underperformance. The aid trap, when help becomes harm. Recognizing this crisis, wealthy nations in Europe and North America have committed to providing substantial food aid to Africa year after year. Billions of dollars worth of grain, rice, and other staples are shipped across the ocean with ostensibly humanitarian intentions. But here's where the story takes a troubling turn. In many African nations, weak governance structures and rampant corruption create opportunities for abuse. Aid shipments that should reach hungry families instead get intercepted by corrupt officials at various levels. These embezzled supplies are siphoned off, diverted, and sold. The officials who steal this free aid often dump it onto local markets at prices far below what farmers can compete with. Why would anyone buy grain from a local farmer when they can purchase stolen aid supplies for a fraction of the normal cost? The result is catastrophic for African agriculture. Hard-working farmers who have invested their limited resources into growing crops suddenly find they cannot sell their harvests at any reasonable price. Their grain sits in storage facilities, eventually rotting and becoming worthless. Season after season, they watch their efforts yield nothing but losses. Faced with this impossible situation, many farmers simply give up. Why continue farming when the market is flooded with cheap stolen aid? Why plant next season when you know your harvest will have no buyer? The will to farm, the desire to work the land, evaporates, replaced by despair and resignation. This perverse dynamic means that food aid, intended to help, actually undermines the development of sustainable local agriculture. It creates dependency rather than building capacity. The cash crop conundrum: profits over people. Western involvement in African agriculture extends beyond aid. European and American corporations have made significant investments in farming operations across the continent. On the surface, this might seem positive, bringing capital, expertise, and jobs to struggling economies. But there's a fundamental problem with the model these corporations employ. Their primary focus is profit maximization for shareholders back home, not addressing local food security needs. As a result, Western agricultural enterprises concentrate almost exclusively on high-value cash crops: cocoa for chocolate production, cotton for textiles, coffee beans for the global cafe market, and similar commodities. These crops generate impressive revenues for the companies that grow them and the international markets that consume them. Cocoa from Africa feeds the global chocolate industry worth over $100 billion. African cotton supplies fashion brands worldwide. African coffee beans brew in cafes from New York to Tokyo. But here's the critical point. You cannot eat cocoa beans. Cotton provides no nutrition. Coffee offers no calories to sustaining a hungry family. The local populations working these plantations and living in surrounding communities desperately need staple foods: rice, maize, wheat, vegetables, and protein sources. Yet the most fertile land in their countries is devoted to export crops that do nothing to address their immediate hunger. The agricultural model becomes even more problematic when you consider its vulnerability. Monoculture farming, growing vast areas of a single crop, creates extreme fragility. These systems have virtually no resilience when faced with climate shocks or disease outbreaks. A single drought can devastate an entire cocoa harvest. One pest or pathogen can wipe out thousands of hectares of cotton in weeks. When these disasters strike, The corporations can absorb the losses through their diversified global portfolios. But the local workers and communities dependent on these operations face unemployment and hunger with no safety net. So despite decades of Western agricultural investment in Africa, this profit-driven approach has failed to solve, and in some ways has actually exacerbated, the continent's fundamental food security challenges. The investments enrich foreign companies and produce commodities for distant markets, while local populations continue to go hungry. China's different approach. 6 decades of agricultural partnership. Against this backdrop, one nation has pursued a markedly different strategy in Africa for the past 60 years. That nation is China. Since the 1960s, China has maintained agricultural cooperation programs with African countries, focusing not on extracting profits or growing export commodities, but on building local capacity to grow food that people can actually eat. Chinese agricultural experts have taught African farmers how to cultivate Chinese rice varieties, shared cultivation techniques, and helped establish agricultural systems designed to feed local populations. Agriculture has consistently remained one of the central pillars of China's development assistance to Africa across 6 decades of engagement. This isn't a recent initiative driven by contemporary geopolitical competition. It's a long-standing commitment that predates many of today's global tensions. The scale of this engagement is substantial. China has established 24 agricultural technology demonstration centers across the African continent. These aren't showcase facilities designed for publicity, they're working centers where real knowledge transfer happens daily. Through these centers, China has introduced over 300 advanced agricultural technologies to African farmers, covering everything from improved maize planting techniques to modern vegetable cultivation methods to better cassava propagation systems. The impact has been measurable and significant. In locations where these technologies have been adopted, local crop production has increased by 30 to 60%. Not through unsustainable practices or excessive chemical inputs, but through better techniques, improved varieties, and more effective resource management. But if we're talking about transformative impact, nothing compares to China's introduction of hybrid rice technology to Africa. The hybrid rice revolution, feeding nations. Hybrid rice represents one of the most significant agricultural innovations of the 20th century, developed primarily by Chinese scientists who devoted decades to perfecting high-yielding varieties that could grow in diverse conditions. When this technology reached Africa, it began transforming food security in ways that seemed almost miraculous to farmers who had struggled with low yields for generations. Burundi, a small landlocked country in East Africa, provides perhaps the most compelling example of hybrid rice's potential. In 2018, Chinese agricultural experts introduced hybrid rice varieties to Burundi on an experimental basis. The results were remarkable. Grain production increased so dramatically that the number of internally displaced people in the country, those forced to leave their homes due to conflict and food insecurity, decreased by 30% in just 1 year compared to the previous period. Perhaps even more striking, the incidence of malaria dropped by half, likely because better nutrition strengthened people's immune systems and gave them resources to protect their homes and health. Encouraged by these initial successes, China launched a first-phase hybrid rice experimental program in Burundi. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. The maximum yield achieved reached 13.86 tons per hectare, an extraordinary figure by any standard. To understand how revolutionary this was, consider that traditional rice varieties in Burundi typically yielded just over 2 tons per hectare. The hybrid varieties were producing 5 to 6 times more food from the same amount of land, water, and labor. For farmers who had struggled to feed their families, this represented a complete transformation of their economic reality. Word of these successes spread rapidly. By 2020, agricultural demonstration sites using Chinese hybrid rice had expanded from the initial handful of hectares to thousands of hectares spread across more than 10 provinces throughout Burundi. The technology was scaling up at remarkable speed because farmers could see the results with their own eyes. By 2022, the average rice yield across Burundi had risen from 3 tons per hectare to over 10 tons, more than tripling productivity in just 4 years. This wasn't happening in one lucky village or one well-funded pilot project. It was happening across the country. The transformation in Madagascar tells a similar story. This large island nation off Africa's eastern coast has seen Chinese hybrid rice cultivation expand to cover more than 75,000 hectares. The average yield is 7.5 tons per hectare, more than 3 times what traditional Malagasy rice varieties produce. For millions of African families, Chinese hybrid rice has meant the difference between hunger and having enough to eat. It has allowed children to grow up properly nourished. It has enabled farmers to sell surplus production and escape the trap of subsistence agriculture. It has saved countless lives through the simple but profound act of providing adequate food. Scaling up, China's renewed commitment is, well, really something to take note of. Building on these successes, China announced a significant expansion of its agricultural support for Africa in 2024. The commitment includes $120 million in emergency food aid, specifically targeted at helping African nations cope with reduced food production caused by natural disasters. The continent faces mounting challenges from land desertification, the process by which productive land turns to desert. Persistent droughts have become more frequent and severe, likely linked to global climate change patterns. Locust swarms, among nature's most devastating agricultural pests, have plagued several regions, devouring crops across vast areas in mere days. The emergency aid is designed to address immediate crises, while longer-term agricultural development projects build sustainable capacity. But the most ambitious initiative is taking shape in Angola, where China is launching what might be called a super agriculture project with a 5-year timeline and a budget of $250 million. The Angola project represents, honestly, a totally new agricultural model. In July of this year, China and Angola formalized a cooperation agreement that outlines an extraordinarily ambitious agricultural development program. The core plan calls for developing a 100,000-hectare planting area, that's roughly 247,000 acres, or about 380 square miles of farmland, an area larger than some small nations. This massive tract will be dedicated primarily to growing staple crops, maize, and soybeans. These aren't luxury cash crops for export to wealthy markets. They're fundamental food sources that form the basis of nutrition for millions of people. The project has 2 complementary objectives. First, it aims to produce enough food to meet Angola's domestic needs, reducing the country's dependence on food imports and building genuine food security for its population. Second, it will export surplus production back to China, creating a mutually beneficial trade relationship that gives Angola foreign exchange earnings while diversifying China's food supply sources. The initial groundwork has already begun. 2 plots of land in northwestern Angola have been surveyed and prepared for cultivation. Once land use rights are formally secured through the legal processes, planting operations will commence in earnest. But this isn't just about land and seeds. China is committing substantial human resources to ensure success. The plan calls for deploying 500 agricultural experts to Angola. Scientists, agronomists, irrigation specialists, and farming professionals who will bring decades of accumulated expertise. These experts won't simply supervise operations, they'll train local farmers and build institutional capacity that will outlast the project itself. The initiative also includes a program to identify and cultivate 1,000 agricultural prosperity leaders, local Angolans who will be trained intensively so they can become champions of improved farming practices within their communities. Additionally, China will help establish 100 demonstration villages specifically focused on agricultural poverty reduction, creating models that can be studied and replicated elsewhere. The timeline is aggressive but achievable. Project planners expect to have 10,000 to 20,000 hectares of cultivated land operational by next year, just the first phase of the larger plan. To support the financial requirements of such a massive undertaking, Chinese enterprises will take the lead in establishing a dedicated agricultural support fund, ensuring that money flows consistently to where it's needed without the delays and corruption that have plagued other development initiatives. The farming approach will incorporate cutting-edge agricultural techniques proven in Chinese farming operations. The goal is to achieve maize yields of 8 tons per hectare and soybean yields of 5 tons per hectare, figures that would represent significant improvements over current Angolan agricultural productivity. Based on these projected yields, agricultural analysts estimate that the crops produced from this 100,000 hectare area could feed approximately 3 million people annually. That's roughly 15% of Angola's current population, a genuinely transformative impact on national food security. Critically, project leaders view this 100,000 hectare development as a pilot initiative, not an endpoint. If it succeeds as planned, the model will be expanded to additional areas, potentially multiplying the impact many times over in the years to come.
The four giants, Western grain merchants. Well, they definitely took notice. When news of China's Angola agricultural project was announced, it triggered immediate concern among four of the world's most powerful corporations, companies that most ordinary people have never heard of, but which exert enormous influence over what the world eats. These are the big four grain merchants: Cargill, ADM, Bunge, and Louis Dreyfus Company. Together, these four corporations control more than 80% of global grain trade, a staggering concentration of power over humanity's most essential resource. Let me introduce you to each. Cargill, based in the United States, is America's largest privately held company and one of the most powerful corporations you've never heard of. Cargill's operations span virtually every link in the global food industry chain, from seeds and fertilizers to processing, transportation, and final food products. The company's reach is almost incomprehensible in its scope. ADM, also American, specializes in the acquisition and export of agricultural commodities. They operate massive networks of grain elevators, processing facilities, and export terminals that funnel agricultural products from America's heartland to markets worldwide. Bunge, another U.S.-based corporation, has established extensive soybean and corn planting operations throughout South America, particularly in Brazil and Argentina. They've turned vast areas of the South American interior into industrial-scale farming operations, feeding global markets. Louis Dreyfus Company, headquartered in France, has built a global network of warehousing and transportation infrastructure that moves grain from producing regions to consuming nations with remarkable efficiency. For decades, these four corporations have been deeply embedded in African markets. They have effectively monopolized many of the continent's grain import and export channels, positioning themselves as indispensable middlemen in African food systems. Their dominance rests on control over the entire supply chain. They don't just buy and sell grain, they control the seeds that farmers plant, the storage facilities where harvests are kept, the ports where shipments are processed, the vessels that transport goods, and even the financial credit systems that farmers depend on to operate. From the moment a seed goes into the ground to the instant a grain product reaches a consumer's table, these four companies have a hand in nearly every step. Perhaps even more importantly, they monopolize critical market information. Data about global grain inventories, price fluctuations, weather forecasts affecting major growing regions, and emerging crop diseases, information that should arguably be public knowledge, is instead held privately by these corporations. This information asymmetry allows them to make strategic decisions while other market participants remain in the dark. They can anticipate price movements before anyone else. They can position themselves in advance of shortages or surpluses. They can effectively influence the trajectory of global grain prices through their market decisions. all while the vast majority of farmers and consumers have no idea what's actually happening in global agricultural markets. There's another dimension to their operations that's even more concerning. These corporations often enter African markets under the banner of humanitarian assistance, food aid programs that appear to be purely charitable initiatives designed to help hungry populations. But the reality is frequently more complex and far less altruistic. By flooding markets with cheap or free grain during periods of local abundance, they undercut local farmers who cannot compete with such artificially low prices. Local agricultural sectors collapse. Farmers abandon their land, and once local production has been sufficiently damaged, these corporations are positioned to capture market share permanently, creating long-term import dependencies that benefit their business models. This is why China's agricultural initiative in Angola has made these four giants extremely nervous.
So, why does Africa's food independence threaten Western profits? If Africa, or even significant parts of Africa, achieves genuine food self-sufficiency, the business model of the Big Four grain merchants faces a fundamental challenge. Currently, African nations import vast quantities of grain because their domestic production cannot meet demand. These imports generate enormous revenues for the companies that supply them. More importantly, the dependency gives these corporations tremendous leverage over African economies and food systems. But imagine if countries like Angola begin producing substantial grain surpluses. Imagine if hybrid rice transformations like those in Burundi and Madagascar spread across the continent. Imagine if Chinese agricultural technology enables African farmers to fully utilize even half of the continent's available arable land.